Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. My daughter-in-law told me to go away and keep that old ranch at my husband's will reading. 1 week later, the state mine inspector taped off a forgotten drift beneath my pantry. A title abstract proved the mineral rights under their city lot were reserved to Sagebrush Ranch, and a mining company offered a $5 million lease with quarterly royalties. The bank flagged their refinance on that same title line. My phone lit with 83 calls, and in rooms with lawyers, and at a county hearing about dust water and boundaries, the woman who dismissed me begged, "I am May Carter, a 69-year-old widow, and this is how paperwork and patience taught me the difference between being needed and being valued." The conference room smelled like lemon oil and old paper that never quite leaves a place like this. Tucson winter light slid through the tall windows and laid pale rectangles across the table. I kept my hands folded so tightly my knuckles looked like small seashells. Pat Wells sat at the head with a stack of documents and a glass of water. My son Jack sat to my right, shoulders rounded as if bracing for a wave. On my left, his wife Ava crossed one leg and watched the room as if she were already planning where everything should go. Her phone lay face down. It buzzed every few seconds against the wood. Pat began to read. He had the kind of courtroom voice that makes bad news sound like weather. He said the name of my husband, Lee Carter, and the date he died in January. He read the phrases about being of sound mind and loving family. The space between me and my son felt longer with every sentence. I watched the rim of Jack's paper cup. I watched the tiny bubbles cling to the glass by Pat's hand. I told myself to breathe and keep my spine straight. Ava shifted, leaned toward me with a citrus perfume that made my eyes sting and said, "Go away and keep that old ranch." She said it like a favor, as if she were letting me take the stained couch no one else wants. Jack inhaled and stared at the table. He did not look at me. He pressed his thumb into the cardboard sleeve of his cup until it left a dark circle. Pat paused, then continued in the same steady tone. "Sagebrush Ranch in Cochise County goes to May. The house in town remains under Jack's management with the investment accounts according to the plan signed last fall." He asked if there were questions. His eyes moved from me to Jack to Ava and back again. I said I understood. My voice sounded small and tidy, like it had been stapled to the inside of my chest. Jack cleared his throat and asked about the timeline for utilities and insurance. Ava asked whether the storage unit off Broadway was included and when she could have keys for contractor access. She said they were meeting a designer on Friday. She said she had samples chosen for a new kitchen and she wanted a proper range because her parents would be visiting in March. Pat explained that nothing changed today. He explained filings, notices, signatures, the movement of paper that turns wishes into things you can touch. He said he would email a list this afternoon. I folded a tissue into a thin rope so I would not reach for Jack's hand. When I finally looked up, Ava had turned her phone over and was typing. I saw words brighten and go dark. Kitchen. Demo. Friday. A tiny thrill lifted her mouth. She glanced at me and smiled without warmth. Pat gathered the documents with practiced hands. He slid a card across the table and said to call if I needed anything clarified. Jack stood finally met my eyes, and for a breath I thought he might step to my side. He gripped the back of his chair instead. He said he would call later. He said there was a lot to do. I told him to drive carefully. I told him I loved him. The words felt like things I should lay gently somewhere safe. In the hallway, my shoes made soft sounds on the carpet. The receptionist wished me a good afternoon in a careful voice. At the elevator, I watched the light ring blink above the button. The brushed metal panel held a faint reflection of a woman who had learned to sit very still while life was measured out in paperwork. I thought of Lee's laugh when we were young and broke and willing. I thought of the way he would say that land remembers. Outside, the air was bright and thin. The Santa Catalinas were a cool purple line, and the sun had that Tucson sharpness that makes everything honest. My car door felt too light in my hand. I sat with the key resting in my palm and listened to the lot breathe. A bus hissed somewhere behind me. A pigeon landed on the edge of a planter and looked me over like a clerk who does not recognize you. My phone buzzed. A text from Pat said he would send the checklist by end of day and was available for questions. Another ping brought a message from a neighbor who had brought muffins after the funeral. She asked whether I needed anything from the store. I thanked her and said I was fine. I said I might be out of town for a few days. It was not out of town, not really. The ranch sits just far enough to change the air you breathe and the sound your thoughts make. Jack did not text. Ava did not text. Somewhere in the building behind me, a laugh rose and fell, and then stopped. I turned the key. The engine answered with that old faithful sigh that says, "I am here." I backed out and followed a city bus for a mile, just to let something larger than me decide the pace. When the bus turned into the transit center, I kept south. The city loosened its grip with every block. The buildings crouched. The sky lifted. The road flattened and ran straight. The mountains to the east kept me company like quiet animals who know exactly where they are going. I remembered the first time I saw Lee at the ranch when we were new and unafraid. He had grease on his hands and a sunburn along his neck and patience in his eyes. He showed me the fence line by the wash and said, "Coyotes will find the low spot if you do not walk it in spring." He said he did not know what he would do with the place, but knew he should not sell it in a hurry. He kept that promise even when we counted grocery money by singles. At a red light near the airport, a plane lifted slow and sure nose up, engines steady. I watched it climb into the small, hard blue. The light changed. I went on. Past the last billboard promising a better mattress, past the last convenience store with bright ice signs, the shoulder turned to gravel. I rolled the window down and let winter air find my face. It carried dust and a clean mineral edge I always forget until it returns. The mailbox appeared with its faded numbers, one digit nearly gone. The tires made that familiar crunch in the drive. The porch step gave its second board creak in greeting. I carried my bag to the door and set it inside. The house smelled like dry wood and lemon oil from the last time I wiped the mantel before the funeral. Light came in at an angle and made the dust turn gold. Somewhere a loose screen tapped a slow beat against a frame. I stood and let the quiet settle around me. The living room wore the shapes of our life the way an old sweater holds the bend of an elbow. I could see where a sofa once lived by the window, and where Lee had rested a boot heel on the rug in a way that used to annoy me. I could feel the ghost of a winter argument and the cool relief that followed when one of us admitted we were tired and wrong. The house did not ask me for anything. It waited. I looked down the hall toward the kitchen and farther toward the basement door beyond the pantry. I told myself I would not go near those stairs tonight. I told myself I would sleep on the good side of the old couch and call the sheriff in the morning to ask about a safety check. I would do only the next right thing. I would not try to hold the whole year in my hands at once. I set my keys in the bowl by the door. The sound they made was small and clean, and for the first time all day, it felt like something had landed where it belonged. The front door gave a tired groan, and the smell of dry wood rose to meet me, a mix of dust and lemon oil from the last time I wiped the mantel before the funeral. Light slid in low and turned the air gold wherever it touched the baseboards. Out back, the windmill turned in slow, uneven circles, and a faint metal squeak drifted through the screen. I set my bag on the chair by the door, rolled up my sleeves, and decided that work would come first and thinking would come later. I unlatched the windows to change the air. The curtains lifted and fell as if someone had just walked through them. In the living room, the sheets I had thrown over the furniture were pale and gritty. I carried them to the porch and shook them hard. Dust rose in soft clouds, and the afternoon sun caught each grain, a thin river of light moving through the air. Under the sheet, the old couch looked the same, the arm worn smooth where Lee used to rest his forearm while he read the sports page. I wiped the mantel and coffee table with a damp cloth and watched the wood wake up. The house answered with small, familiar sounds, the click of a settling window frame, and the tap of a loose screen in the wind. In the hall closet, I found a cardboard box with an old label that said photos in a slanted hand. I carried it to the coffee table and lifted the lid. The first stack was birthdays and school plays and a picnic by the wash that ended in rain and laughter. Beneath those were older prints with scalloped edges, the paper thicker and stiff. One picture showed a woman with dark hair and a sharp chin standing by a windmill that still wore bright paint. On the back of a card, someone had written the name Elena and a year in the 1940s. The ink had turned brown at the edges. I traced the letters with my thumb as if they were stitched thread. At the bottom of the box, I found a thin bundle of letters tied with faded string. The top page was careful English with Spanish words threaded through. I read about the creek bed and about survey lines and about a vein that ran on a diagonal across the lower pasture. The voice on the page was plain and certain, like someone who had learned to trust what the land told her. I set the letters aside. The light in the kitchen had shifted, and the pantry door gave a quiet click when I opened it. The entrance to the basement stairs sits beyond the pantry, easy to forget until you go looking. The knob resisted, then turned. A cool draft rose and carried the dark, sweet smell of old lumber and the clear mineral edge of earth. I lifted my phone and let the beam fall down the stairs. The first tread gave a small complaint, and the handrail felt dry as bone when I tested it. Near the bottom, a board had gone black at the edges where damp must have gathered in a storm. I stayed at the threshold. I was not going to put weight on wood that was already warning me. I told myself to make a record. I used the phone to take slow pictures without moving my feet. One of the steps, one of the joint where the rail met the wall, one of the low ceiling with a thin wandering crack, one wide frame of the concrete landing. The light reached just far enough to show a shadowed opening to the left, braced with old timbers whose ends were chewed and splintered. I did not lean in. I took one more picture for the file, and I closed the door. Back at the sink, I ran the tap until the water turned clear and cold. I drank slowly and felt my chest settle. On the refrigerator, I kept a small grocery pad. I tore off a sheet and wrote in block letters, "Do not enter basement until safety check." I said the words out loud in the quiet kitchen and felt steadier for hearing my own voice. I stuck the note to the door with a round magnet shaped like a roadrunner. Jack made that magnet in 2nd grade. The bird had lost one eye long ago and still looked as if it were in a hurry. The sun slipped lower, and the rooms took on that lavender edge Arizona gives the hour before dark. I swept the porch and shook the small rugs by the doors. The mailbox could wait. The refrigerator could wait. The only thing that could not wait was a call to the county. I sat at the table and opened my contacts. The number for the Cochise County Sheriff was already saved from a summer when a bold coyote kept testing the fence line. The dispatcher answered with a voice that sounded like she had heard everything. I gave my name and the ranch address and said I had a basement with old stairs and what looked like a tunnel opening, and that I did not plan to go near it until I had guidance. She asked if there was movement or a gas smell or anything urgent. I told her no. She said a deputy could stop by in the morning to take a look and help coordinate with the state mine inspector if needed. She asked if 8 in the morning would work. I told her it would. When I hung up, I wrote Deputy Cole Ramirez at 8 on the same scrap and tucked it under the Roadrunner magnet. I made tea and held the mug with both hands. The old clock in the living room ticked without any interest in hurrying. On the table, the bundle of letters waited. I untied the string and read a few more lines. Elena wrote that late summer winds shift after midnight, and that goats refuse one patch of grass even when hungry. She wrote that her father taught her to read land by its small objections. The words felt like a hand on my shoulder, not a push, just a steadying touch. I put the letters back and washed the cup. I spread a clean sheet over the couch and set a pillow at the end where the fabric was still whole. I was too tired to dress a bed, and the couch would do. The house had cooled enough that a blanket felt welcome on my knees. The wind outside moved across the corners, and the screen gave a soft tap and rest, tap and rest. I checked the locks and stood for a moment at the basement door. It looked plain again, painted wood, and a latch that wanted oil. I touched the knob to be sure, and then returned to the couch. Sleep came in short pieces. I woke once to the clock marking an hour, and once to the wind turning over the roof. In the breathing dark, I thought about Lee saying that land remembers. I saw the bright windmill from the old photograph, and a woman walking the lower pasture with a notebook in her hand. I saw a line on paper running from the back fence to the mesquite grove near the wash. I let the pictures move past without grabbing hold. Morning would bring a knock on the door and a calm voice that knew how to talk about old wood and new rules. Morning would bring a list and a plan and a straight way forward. I let the house breathe around me, 4 walls that still knew my name, and I rested until the light came back. Morning arrived sharp and clean, and the pasture looked rinsed. I brewed coffee and set 1 mug on the counter and put the second back in the cabinet before habit made me reach for it. A white county cruiser turned into the drive at 10 to 8, and a man in a tan uniform stepped out. He introduced himself as Deputy Cole Ramirez and asked if I was May. His voice had the steady weight of someone called when fear is new, but risk is old. I walked him through the kitchen and handed him my phone with the photographs from the night before. He studied each image slowly, as if the edges might hold a secret the center did not. He asked how far I had gone. I told him I had stayed at the threshold and not an inch farther. He nodded once, then asked to see the door. At the pantry, he raised a compact flashlight and laid a firm beam along the handrail. The tread faces the low ceiling, the landing below. The board near the bottom had gone dark where damp had lingered. He leaned a shoulder against the jamb to keep his balance and examined the shadowed opening to the left. He said the timbers looked like old shoring for a drift, and that time had been busy. He asked me to wait in the kitchen while he made a call. He spoke to dispatch and then to a number he seemed to know by heart. He kept his voice level and used the kinds of words that turn worry into a checklist. He came back to the table and told me the state mine inspector was nearby and could be here within the hour. He set his flashlight down like a placeholder and asked if I had eaten. I said coffee was enough for now, and he smiled with his eyes and said he would not argue with a woman in her own kitchen. A state SUV pulled in a little after 9. A woman in a navy jacket with the state seal came to the porch with a small hard case in one hand and a calm technician behind her. She introduced herself and asked me to walk her through my decisions the night before. I told it straight. She thanked me for staying at the threshold and asked to see the stairs. They worked in the doorway with quiet voices and small tools. The technician used a narrow awl to test wood, and the tip found soft places where time had eaten through. The inspector noted the tread depth from the threshold with a bright tape and traced a finger along a gap where a support met the wall. She said the opening to the left was likely a drift, and that whoever built the shoring had known what they were doing a very long time ago, but that the structure was now past any useful life. She did not dramatize. She wrote on a board with tidy letters and steady hands. Bright yellow tape went up across the pantry at chest height, and a simple printed sign warned against entry. The inspector explained what would happen next. An engineer would review the notes and photographs. Until then, no one would lean past the first tread. If I needed items from the dry and safe portion near the top, the technician could use a grabber tool while she supervised from the doorway. She said the safety rules in spaces like this often followed both OSHA and MSHA guidance. She said we would follow the rules. They brought in a lantern that threw a clean white light and set it on the upper step. The technician worked the grabber with patience and dignity, coaxing a wooden crate from the landing with a dry scrape. He set it on the kitchen floor and then brought up a smaller one. He said that would be all until an engineer had had a look. I knelt by the larger crate and lifted the lid. Inside were small bundles wrapped in old paper. I unrolled one, and a chunk of rock settled into my palm with a river weight. The matrix was gray and cool, and a bright run of blue-green cut through it like a vein under skin. Each piece was labeled in pencil with a code and a depth that meant nothing to me, but would mean something to someone. The inspector leaned into the doorway and studied the color and said nothing. She did not have to. The smaller crate held folders rounded soft at the corners and a rolled map that wanted to stay in a circle. I eased the band and spread the paper on the table. It showed the pasture and the fence lines and the wash and a few trees marked with small ticks. Across the lower half, a line ran diagonal from the southwest corner toward the northeast fence. A bearing was noted in firm script. My throat tightened. In the letters from last night, Elena had written about a diagonal line across the lower pasture. The phrasing had been plain and patient. The map felt like a voice answering across years. Under the folders lay a thin assay summary from a small laboratory I did not recognize. The stamp was faded, but the typed line in the center was clear when I tipped the page to the light. It stated that copper grade sat above a commercial threshold. The inspector asked if she could photograph that line for her file. I slid the page toward her. She took a careful picture without touching the paper and handed my phone back. A manila envelope waited at the bottom of the crate. The flap lifted easily. Inside sat a letter dated late November of 2022 on the letterhead of Sonoran Copper and Minerals in Tucson. The language was precise and courteous. It invited the owner of Sagebrush Ranch to discuss terms for a mineral lease and referenced preliminary work connected to a historical family name. The room shifted while I read. The kitchen felt both very near and very far, as if the air had decided to stand in two places at once. The inspector and the deputy shared a look that was not surprise so much as recognition. She returned to procedure with that steady voice I had come to trust in less than an hour. She said the tape would stay and the door would remain closed. An engineer would review the site and she would send me a copy of her report. She handed me a card with her name and a number that went straight to her desk. She told me to call if anything changed, even if it felt small. The technician gathered the lantern and the grabber, and they thanked me for my care and for the coffee I had forgotten I had offered. Deputy Cole walked them out and thanked them again. At the porch, the inspector paused and looked across the pasture the way a doctor reads a face before speaking. Then they were gone. The house took a breath and returned to its own sounds. The tape in the pantry doorway glowed like a new rule. I cleared a space on the table and smoothed the map under 2 mugs until it agreed to lie flat. I stacked the folders and slipped the assay summary into a plastic sleeve I found in Lee's desk. I wrapped the rock samples in fresh paper towels and set them in a clean box with a lid that would close. The letter from Sonoran Copper and Minerals sat in front of me. I read it again more slowly. Polite words, specific phrases. An invitation to a conversation I had not known was waiting. Elena's bundle was where I had left it. I untied the string and found the page where she described the wind shifting after midnight and the goats refusing a patch of grass even when hungry. She noted the diagonal the same way the map did. It felt less like coincidence and more like a line that had been trying to be seen for a long time and had finally found eyes willing to see it. I opened a notebook and began a list in large, clear letters. Call Sonoran Copper and Minerals. Ask for a meeting. Find a mineral rights attorney in Tucson. Contact Desert Title and Escrow and request the title abstract to confirm any reservations. Ask the inspector for her report and the name of the engineer assigned. Make copies and store originals in the desk drawer that still smells of cedar. I poured the last of the coffee into a fresh mug and stood at the sink. The windmill turned once and settled. A hawk drew a line across the far edge of the field and disappeared beyond the mesquite. The house behind me was the same house I had unlocked last night, and not the same. A yellow ribbon in the pantry promised order. A hand-drawn diagonal on old paper asked to be taken seriously. I slid the letter and the assay sheet into a folder and set it in the drawer. Then I wrote one more line on the list with the same slow hand Lee used when he labeled jars in the garage. Do only the next right thing. I underlined it once. The sound of the pen on paper was small and sure, and it felt like a hinge catching where it should. By late morning, I had already made the first calls. The office at Sonoran Copper and Minerals picked up on the second ring, and a calm woman arranged for a field supervisor to visit that afternoon with their geologist. She said his name was Frank Torres, and that he would arrive with Dr. Sarah Chen. I agreed to be at the ranch and set the phone down beside the binder that was growing heavier by the hour. The white pickup rolled into the drive after lunch, and the dust settled on the grass like a soft curtain. Frank stepped out first, a steady man with the look of someone who has learned to listen to ground. Sarah followed with a tablet and a small field kit. I led them straight to the pantry so they could see the yellow tape and the sign from the state. Frank studied the doorway without crossing it and nodded once in approval. He suggested we walk the pasture instead. We started at the windmill and moved downhill. Sarah paced in even lines, pausing where soil color shifted or where stones had gathered as if rain had pulled them into company. She held the tablet out to compare the screen with the fence lines and the shape of the wash. I unfolded the hand-drawn map on the picnic table and pinned the corners with 2 mugs. Sarah traced the diagonal with a fingertip, then raised her eyes to the lower pasture and said, the old plotting matched what she would expect if a copper vein ran from the southwest corner toward the northeast fence. Frank shaded his brow with his hand and looked that way for a long moment, as if letting the land speak first. We followed the imagined line through waist-high grass. At a shallow break in the surface that looked like nothing and something all at once, Frank pointed and said, "A fault will tell on itself if you are patient." Sarah crouched and used a small pick to lift a fragment of rock, brushed dust away with her thumb, and exposed a thin green thread running through the gray matrix. She kept her voice even when she said that the old assay I had showed them would fit what we were seeing. She explained that any modern work would begin with a pilot phase or with bulk sampling, and that environmental permits from the state would guide the steps. She mentioned baseline air and water monitoring and coordination with the state mine inspector, especially when old workings are present. Her tone made procedure sound like respect rather than delay. Back in the kitchen, I laid the samples from the crate on a clean towel. Sarah lined them in a neat row near the window and studied them in natural light. She spoke briefly about tenor and host rock and weathering, then met my eyes and said the phrase on the historic assay that placed copper grade above a commercial threshold was careful, not wishful. Frank asked about boundaries and whether the parcel had been carved since the 1940s. I told them I planned to request a full abstract from Desert Title and Escrow. He agreed that this was wise, adding that mineral rights do not necessarily follow what a person can see on the surface. Sarah added that a vein does not stop for a street or a fence line. We stepped outside again and looked toward the newer subdivision on the far side of the wash where my son lives. Frank measured with his eye the way an old carpenter does and said if the bearing on the map held the line of interest might pass beneath that neighborhood. He did not say it as a threat. He spoke as if he were telling me the direction of weather. We returned to the table and Sarah opened her tablet to a colored overlay of past interpretations. The deeper bands lay beneath the same diagonal that my ancestor had drawn. She reminded me that geology keeps its own time, and that money can be impatient, and that good work happens when both agree not to rush. I brought out the letter from Sonoran Copper and Minerals, dated late November of 2022. Frank read it and said their office could schedule a formal meeting in Tucson to discuss potential terms if I wished to proceed, and that my attorney should be included from the beginning. The way he said it made me trust him more, not less. Sarah asked whether I had counsel in mind. I told her I intended to call Pat Wells, the attorney who had handled my husband's will. Frank said Pat was respected and that a good mineral rights lawyer earns their fee by telling a client where not to sign. That sentence settled into me like a fence post set in the right hole. They shook my hand and promised to file short field notes so that scheduling would move quickly if I asked for it. They reminded me they would not step into the basement without the inspector. As the truck rolled away, the dust lifted and then erased itself, leaving the air clear. I went inside and sat with my phone again. Pat's assistant placed me on a short hold while piano music played softly, then Pat came on the line. I told him I needed counsel for mineral rights and that I wanted him if he would take me. He suggested late morning in Tucson 2 days from now and told me to bring every document I had and a list of questions. His steady voice did what coffee could not. It made my shoulders drop. I called Desert Title and Escrow and asked for a full abstract on the ranch and on the lot where Jack's house sits. The man who answered introduced himself as Ethan Blake and asked me to spell my name twice. He said he would begin the pull and that he believed the reservation of mineral rights from the 1960s would be in the chain. He warned that copies could take a day or two. I told him I would pick them up in person with identification. He said that would be fine and gave me his extension. When the calls were done, I gathered everything into a binder. The map went into a clear sleeve, the assay summary behind it, the letter from Sonoran Copper and Minerals in the front pocket where I could see the date without opening anything. I carried the binder to the bedroom and pulled the small safe from the closet floor. The dial remembered my hand. Inside the cedar block Lee had tucked there years ago still shared its faint, clean scent. I placed the binder and the old letters and the envelope with photographs on the shelf and closed the door. The latch caught with a solid click that sounded like a decision. On the kitchen table, I drew a line through items on my list and added new ones. Confirm meeting with Sonoran after Pat reviews. Bring photographs and samples. Ask Pat about royalties and surface use and water testing obligations. Request digital copies from title, along with certified paper. Keep originals in the safe, carry copies to Tucson. I underlined the last line because it felt like a rule. Light slid across the floor and climbed the cabinet doors. The wind had gone quiet. I made a simple supper, then rinsed my plate and set it to dry. The yellow tape in the pantry doorway glowed in the dim, like a promise to keep the right pace. I checked the travel bag I had used during Lee's treatment years, placed the notebook with my list inside, along with business cards and a flash drive holding scans of the map and the assay sheet. I set the bag by the door so my hand would find it in the morning without searching. Before dusk, I walked to the porch and listened to the windmill creak and rest. Across the pasture, a hawk rode a straight line toward the mesquite and vanished. The ranch felt like a patient teacher who had waited for the student to be ready. Inside, I turned off the kitchen light and stood a moment with my palm on the safe, as if its cool metal could lend me some of its steadiness. Tucson would ask for clear thinking and a steady voice. I felt ready for both. I locked the door, set my keys in the bowl, and let the house settle around me like a shoulder that knows exactly where it belongs. Dawn put a thin silver line on the pasture as I pulled onto the highway toward Tucson. The binder rode beside me, and I rehearsed the simple plan in my head. Keep to facts. Ask the questions. Let Pat handle the sharp edges. Pat's office felt like an air-conditioned pause. He shook my hand, set the binder on the conference table, and turned each page with the care of a man who knows paper can change a life. He studied the map with the diagonal, the old assay line about copper grade above a commercial threshold, and the letter from Sonoran Copper and Minerals. He said we would begin with title and royalties, then head to the company meeting. A receptionist led us into a glass room at SCM with a view of the Catalinas. Frank Torres greeted us with a field manager's calm. Company counsel Lauren set a neat term sheet on the table. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived with a tablet and a small nod. Water glasses and a modest plate of almonds sat in the center, as if to remind everyone to behave like neighbors. Frank summarized the field walk and said their office was ready to discuss a lease if I was. Lauren walked us through the terms in steady language. She said the company proposed a signing bonus of $5 million. Payment would move through escrow within a window of 14 to 30 days after the lease was executed, and listed conditions were satisfied. Royalties would be paid quarterly under a net smelter return formula, with an estimated range between $380,000 and $620,000 per quarter. Once pilot or bulk sampling was complete and required state permits were in place. Pat's pen put a careful mark under 2 sentences on the sheet. One set the upfront $5 million through escrow. The other set quarterly royalties under the NSR formula. He asked Lauren to confirm exactly how escrow would work. She explained that funds would be deposited to a neutral account on signing and released when the closing checklist was met, including proof of authority, recorded memoranda, baseline monitoring underway, and insurance certificates. Pat asked what charges could be deducted in the NSR calculation. Lauren slid an exhibit that listed transport and smelting in plain words. Pat said we would tune the definitions to keep the numbers honest. Sarah spoke about sequence. Baseline air and water monitoring would begin in coordination with the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. Any work near the old drift at my pantry would follow a written plan by an engineer and remain under the eye of the state mine inspector. No equipment would touch the property until permits were in hand and access routes were agreed in writing. Pat placed my hand-drawn map in the center and asked about the diagonal heading toward the subdivision where my son lives. Frank said their interpretations suggested the vein trended in that direction. He said surface ownership and subsurface rights often part ways in Arizona, and that clarity keeps peace. Pat opened a folder and read from a preliminary note just received from Desert Title and Escrow. Mineral rights reserved to Sagebrush Ranch recorded in the 1960s. He let the words sit. I felt the room shift from hope to math. Lauren asked whether we wanted a full abstract before drafting. Pat said it was already ordered and that certified pages would be delivered. He said the lease must state that no surface activity would occur near the city house and that the company acknowledged the existing reservation under the newer neighborhood. Frank agreed. He said good fences work when the fence line is the true one. Pat returned to the numbers. We accept the $5 million signing consideration through escrow. Release must occur within that 14 to 30-day window after execution and completion of the closing checklist. If not, specific remedies trigger. Lauren noted that as acceptable. Pat requested production reporting covenants and audit rights tied to royalties. Lauren agreed in principle and asked Sarah to log the cadence preferred by operations. I said I would have my attorney review the $5 million lease. The words landed with more weight than I expected. Frank gave a small smile and said, "Good legal work makes field work easier." Lauren offered a short memorandum of understanding that captured the headline points. Pat read every line, circled 2 words to change later, and slid it toward me. I signed with a steady hand. He signed as counsel. Lauren countersigned for the company. Pat asked for timing. Lauren said a first draft lease could arrive within a week, with escrow instructions attached. She restated the escrow window, and the quarterly schedule for royalties once permitted activity followed the pilot. Frank added that baseline work could start with the state as soon as access protocols were set. Pat wrote that access would be limited to agreed corridors, and that all contact about the old drift would run through the inspector until an engineer cleared it. Lauren copied the note onto the term sheet in neat blue ink. We shook hands and walked back to Pat's office. In the hallway, he let out a quiet breath and said this was a strong opening. Real numbers. Respectful process. He made a copy set of what I had signed, placed the originals in a red folder, and put it in my hands. He suggested opening a separate account for lease proceeds and royalties, so the funds would have a clean history from birth. He handed me the card of a banker who would not try to sell me anything I did not ask for. Desert Title and Escrow was close by. At the counter, Ethan Blake greeted me with a blue-covered stack. He said these were preliminary copies, and that certified pages would be ready the next afternoon. He pointed to the paragraph that mattered, the one that read mineral rights reserved to Sagebrush Ranch with the 1960s recording reference. He highlighted the book and page and tucked a small sticky where my eye could land. He loaded digital scans onto my flash drive and wished me a good day in a way that felt like a small blessing. Before leaving town, I stopped at my bank and opened a new account with a plain name I could trust later. Lease and Royalties. The manager arranged separate statements and shook my hand. The red folder rested under the binder on the passenger seat where I could reach it if I needed to convince myself that the day had happened. Traffic thinned on the south side and the mountains turned lavender. I drove without the radio and let the order of things settle. Title first. Paper next. People last. At the ranch, the windmill gave a single creak like a welcome. Inside, I unlocked the small safe, slid the red folder beside the map and the old letters, and spun the dial until the tumblers settled. In the kitchen, I wrote 3 new lines in my notebook. Review draft lease with Pat. Confirm escrow instructions. When funds release, call the hospital billing office and settle Lee's final balance by choice, not demand. I capped the pen, listened to the quiet, and felt the house hold steady while the last of the Tucson light left the floor. Morning carried a quiet I had not felt in months. Coffee steadied my hands, and the list on the table looked less like a wall and more like a path. I opened the laptop to send Pat a note and found a message from Ethan at Desert Title and Escrow waiting. He had attached preliminary scans for both the ranch and the city lot where Jack lives. In the ranch packet, a clear sentence sat in the middle of a page as if planted there for this day. Mineral rights reserved to Sagebrush Ranch, recorded 1964 with book and page numbers. The city lot packet showed a later transfer of the surface with the reservation carried forward by reference. I saved both sets to a folder named for the date and copied the recording numbers into my notebook like seeds that needed a row. A few minutes later, Pat texted to confirm the term sheet had arrived on his end and that he would call as soon as the first draft of the lease landed. I set the phone face down and rinsed my cup. Outside, the windmill turned once and went still. The house felt aligned with the work. By mid-morning, the calm began to ripple. An unfamiliar number flashed, then another. I let them fall to voicemail because peace can be a choice you practice. Jack's name appeared next, then vanished as I watched. The laptop chimed at the same time. Jack had forwarded an email from a loan officer at SunWest Bank named Rachel Kim. A conditional approval for their refinance sat attached like a sealed envelope. Inside the letter spoke in the quiet voice official paper uses when it knows it will get its way. An approval amount was listed, then a cluster of conditions that had to be met before closing. A pricing section set an interest rate higher than any kitchen plan could love. Farther down a line explained why. Title exception noted. Mineral rights under subject property reserved to Sagebrush Ranch, recorded 1964. Obtain acceptable resolution or proceed with pricing adjustments and lender protections. Before I could read it a third time, a new email arrived from Ethan. He summarized the reservation in plain language and attached a one-page lay explanation with the key sentence centered where no one could miss it. He added that certified copies would be ready the next afternoon. I wrote his extension in the margin of my notebook and slid the pen into the spiral to keep it there. The phone kept lighting like summer heat lightning. Ava's name. An unknown number I suspected was a banker's desk. Jack again. I stepped outside and swept the porch just to give my hands something useful. The broom rasped on the boards and the air carried that clean mineral edge that always follows a cold morning. I shook the mat and thought about escrow windows and patience as a tool, not a virtue. Near noon, I answered one call without meaning to and heard my son's breath find shape. He asked whether I had seen the bank letter. He asked if I could help clear up whatever this was so the kitchen could start and the payment would not jump. I said the recorder holds the title and that he should speak with his loan officer and a real estate attorney if he needed explanation. I told him I was in the middle of something and would follow up when I had time. The silence that followed sounded like a man counting to hold himself still. He thanked me too quickly and ended the call. Another message arrived from a voice I did not know that referenced SunWest Bank and requested a return call. A second message followed from a staffer copied by Ethan. Then Ava's name began to pulse in the missed call list like a metronome set too fast. I turned the ringer off and set the phone in the center of the table as if it were a too-hot pan. The laptop chimed again. Jack had forwarded a shorter email from Rachel asking him to acknowledge receipt of the conditional approval and the rate changes. She offered options that would allow the loan to proceed if the title exception could not be removed. One was to accept the higher rate and additional lender protections. One was to reduce the cash out for renovations. Another was to pause and address title through legal channels. Her tone stayed courteous and clinical. The numbers did not. I closed the laptop and washed my plate. I folded the towel with more care than it needed and went back to the table. The phone sat quiet now because I had taken its voice away. The house breathed the way old houses do when afternoon heat has not yet come and the morning chill is not quite gone. The early afternoon brought a tight cluster of calls that felt like the leading edge of a summer storm. A contractor's number I did not recognize rang twice with no message. Ava called, then called again, then tried a second line. Jack's name slid between them as if he could wedge calm into the space. I opened the forwarded bank letter once more to be sure I had not read it out of shape. The language did not move. The rate was the rate. The title note was the same dry sentence I had seen in the abstract that morning. I printed the letter and the one-page title summary and slipped them behind the term sheet in my binder. Paper in order. Then I placed the binder in the safe and spun the dial until the tumblers found the groove. Cool metal steadied my fingertips. I walked the fence line along the wash to let the air finish what the coffee had started. A hawk cut a line toward the mesquite and vanished. I thought about how quickly need can dress itself as urgency and how often it asks for the wrong sacrifice. In the red folder in the safe sat the memorandum from Tucson. In my notebook, the last line I had written the night before waited with a kind of quiet authority. Pay the hospital when escrow releases because I choose to. When I came back inside, the light had turned warm on the floorboards. The phone buzzed once with a new voicemail. I did not reach for it. I made tea and stood by the sink while the kettle took its time. The windmill creaked once, as if to say it was still here and not in a hurry. Near sunset, I picked up the phone and looked at the list. Jack. Ava. Unknown. Unknown. A number that looked like a corporate desk. Jack again. The counter at the top showed a number that surprised me and did not. 83. I opened the most recent voicemail and let it play through the small speaker. Jack's voice sounded strained and too loud. He said, "Mom, please call me back. And he said we have called you 83 times, and he said the bank was pressing and could we talk?" I pressed my thumb to end the message and placed the phone face down so it stopped being a small window and returned to being a piece of glass and metal. I slid the switch back to silent for good measure and set it in the center of the table. Outside, the last of the light reached across the pasture and folded itself away. The clock in the front room counted a minute I did not have to spend on anyone else's panic. I watched the dark glass rectangle and let the quiet stand. Some truths do not need my voice to be heard. Pat had a small conference room ready when I arrived, a square table, legal pads at each seat, a pitcher of water beading on a napkin. I kept my phone on silent in my purse. The screen had begun to feel like a stage I did not owe anyone. Jack came in first with his shoulders curved from a long week. Ava followed a step behind, composed, scanning the room the way a buyer inspects a model home. Pat greeted us with courthouse calm and said he would keep notes so the record did not have to rely on memory. We sat. Ava opened with a plan before anyone had taken a sip of water. In her view, the smart move was to combine assets. She said they could build a nice room over their garage so I could be close to the children. She said she would manage the finances for efficiency and that we could avoid outside interference by keeping everything in the family. She added that the mortgage would be easier if we pulled resources and that proximity would make us all happier. Pat wrote on his pad in short, even lines. Jack cleared his throat and said he wanted peace in his home and no more drama with the bank. He said the kitchen project had gotten ahead of them and that he wished he had slowed things down sooner. For a moment, his voice sounded like the boy who used to admit a mistake and ask for a do-over. I let the room breathe, then set my hands on the table and spoke as plainly as I knew how. I said I would not merge assets. I said I would not live above anyone's garage. I said my conversations about family would be about family. I said conversations about money would go through my attorney. I said boundaries are doors that keep houses standing. Ava tried a patient smile that did not reach her eyes. She said I was making this personal and turning down a generous offer. She said a grandmother nearby is useful, and a consolidated account would reduce confusion at my age. She said the ranch was lonely and the children were missing out. Pat lifted his gaze from the pad and marked a few facts out loud as he wrote them. Desert Title and Escrow had confirmed in writing a recorded reservation of mineral rights to Sagebrush Ranch dating to the 1960s. Sonoran Copper and Minerals had delivered a term sheet with a signing consideration and a quarterly royalty under a net smelter return formula, subject to permits and a closing checklist. A draft lease would arrive within a week with escrow instructions attached. He added that none of those facts suggested any need to combine accounts or alter control of property. Jack stared at the picture but did not pour. He said he had been wrong to stay silent during the will reading. He said he had let pressure talk for him. He said he wanted me in the children's lives for reasons that did not involve drywall. His left hand opened and closed on the table the way it did when he was 10 and sorry. Ava shifted to the fairness argument. She said families are about more than paper and that my husband would have wanted the best for his son. She said shared decisions and shared benefits would honor that. She said money breeds misunderstanding and that she was offering to prevent that by taking responsibility. She said my refusal felt like punishment and that children should not bear adult choices. I answered without raising my voice. I said I was not punishing anyone. I said rescuing people who do not ask to change is a habit I no longer keep. I said I wanted a relationship with my son and with my grandchildren that did not carry dollar signs in every sentence. I said when there are school concerts and soccer games, I will come when invited. I said when they visit the ranch, I will make coffee and cut apples and teach them to read the sky. I said money would stay with counsel. Pat placed his palm on the pad and organized the room. He read the points into his notes. No combined assets, no changes to control of property, all discussions of money through counsel, family visits welcome and not contingent on finances. He said he would circulate minutes for signature so no one had to test their recollection later. He added that he would notify the bank and title that all inquiries about the ranch and the lease should come through his office. Ava's voice thinned. She said I was turning my back on family and on common sense. She said she had made 83 calls yesterday and I had refused all of them. She said the bank was pressing and I could make it all easy with one decision. She warned that people would talk and implied I should care. Jack started to lift a hand toward her arm and stopped. He said he understood why I had not answered. He said shouting at lumber does not build a house. He said he would call Rachel at the bank and deal with the paper that exists. The words were simple and his tone held. Pat brought us to a close. Next steps were straightforward. We would wait for the draft lease. He would review escrow instructions and production reporting language and audit rights. He would set a signing conference when the draft was ready. He would coordinate with the state mine inspector and the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality on baseline work once access protocols were in place. He wrote those items in neat lines and capped his pen. We stood. I shook Jack's hand and touched his shoulder and told him I loved him. I did not enlarge the sentence. Ava gave me a careful smile with no light in it and said she hoped I would reconsider before the rift became permanent and added that children remember how grown people behave. I nodded because the last part was true and needed no reply. Pat walked me to the hallway. He said quiet holds longer than sharp sound and that I had done well. He tucked the printed minutes into a folder and handed it to me and reminded me to forward any bank contact to his office. He opened the door. Outside, Tucson's sun lay warm on the sidewalk and a light breeze ran the block. A bus sighed at the corner. A child laughed at a patient dog. The sky over the Catalinas was that soft winter purple that makes the city feel newly washed. I stood for a breath with the folder in my hand and let my shoulders settle where they belonged. My phone stayed silent. I did not check it. I walked to the car, placed the folder beside the red one from the day before, and closed the door with care. The day felt like it was carrying me rather than dragging me, and I let it. The county hearing room smelled like floor wax and coffee that had waited too long on a burner. Metal chairs sat in straight rows. A long table faced the audience with name placards lined up like small fences. Pat took the seat beside me with a slim binder and a yellow pad. Frank Torres and Dr. Sarah Chen from Sonoran Copper and Minerals settled on the agency side. The state mine inspector stacked forms at her elbow. A woman in a navy blazer with steady eyes called the room to order. Her placard read Marla Green from the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality. Marla explained the purpose in clean sentences. Gather questions. Place requirements on the record. No excavation beyond baseline work until permits and conditions are satisfied. She outlined the order. Company overview. Safety from the mine inspector. Public comment limited to dust, noise, water, traffic, and land stability. Frank stood first and thanked the room. He kept it brief and passed to Sarah. Sarah walked the audience through a few calm slides on a small screen. The company had installed temporary monitors to establish baseline air and water conditions before any expansion. Equipment access would follow a traffic plan that avoided school bus hours. Water trucks and soil binders would hold dust down on unpaved surfaces. Loads would be covered. Wheels would be washed at exit. Operating hours would be capped. She described a closed-loop process for water during pilot work and said no processing would occur on site without additional permits. She did not oversell, and the room listened. The state mine inspector spoke next in a voice that carried without force. Her office had sealed an old drift in the sagebrush pantry area. An engineering plan would govern any interaction with historical workings. No one would step past the first stair until written clearance existed. Sequence was simple. Baseline monitoring, permit review, pilot sampling under a plan with named responsibilities. Reporting and unannounced inspections would follow. She said she did not deal in promises. She dealt in compliance. Marla opened the floor. A man in a ball cap asked whether dust would reach Windy Mesa Elementary. Sarah answered that water trucks and soil binders would be used, stockpiles would be kept low and covered, and real-time particulate meters would push data to a public website and to ADEC. Marla confirmed for the record that ADQ required baseline monitoring of air and water and noted that the program had started before any expansion. She asked Sarah to provide the web address when it went live. A woman with gray hair asked about groundwater. Her well was shallow, and her grandmother had always worried about drawdown. Sarah brought up an aquifer map on the tablet. The local water table sat at a depth not touched by pilot sampling. Any sumps would be lined. A closed circuit would recirculate process water during tests. Additional monitoring wells would be installed and reported to ADAQ. The mine inspector added that any deviation from plan would stop work until fixed. Along our row, shoulders loosened as if the room exhaled at once. A rancher asked about noise at night. Frank said high noise activities would be limited to daytime hours. Generators would carry mufflers and acoustic shields. The traffic plan would keep trucks off residential streets before 8 in the morning and after 6 in the evening. Marla wrote that condition on her sheet and said she would circulate it after the hearing. Then a man with a weathered tan walked to the microphone and unrolled a photocopy with blurred edges. He said his name was Hank Dobson from 2 parcels east. An old-timer had told him the original fence was set wrong and that the diagonal line on the sagebrush map actually crossed his family's place. Folks back then did not always measure straight. The company should keep its hands off land that was not theirs. He tapped the paper with a finger that shook from effort more than age. Marla asked him to hand the copy to staff so it could be scanned into the record. She reminded the room that the hearing could not resolve boundary disputes. Survey evidence controls over memory. Any party with a documented claim could file it with the recorder and with the court across the street. Pat rose and asked to be recognized. Marla nodded. Pat said he represented me and had certified plats and abstracts. He placed a current survey on the projector and matched its corners to the county GIS. He read book and page numbers into the microphone. Monuments had been updated in several cycles, and the recorder's index reflected each update. He laid the title abstract from Desert Title on the table and read the sentence that mattered so the back row could hear it. Mineral rights reserved to Sagebrush Ranch recorded in the 1960s with the reference printed beneath. Hank's parcel was a later surface conveyance, and no mineral rights traveled with it according to the chain. Pat kept his voice low and let the citations do the heavy work. Hank said the old man would disagree. Pat said oral recollection could be submitted but could not displace recorded surveys. Marla thanked both and said the documents would attach to the file. She repeated that rival boundaries did not live in this room. A young mother asked about blasting. Frank said no explosives would be used in the pilot phase, and none would be used within a residential buffer under any future plan without additional hearings. The mine inspector added that any energy work would require separate engineering and public notice. Marla wrote that note and underlined it. A question came about wildlife corridors. Sarah said temporary fencing would include crossings at the wash identified by the state biologist. Lights would be shielded and angled down. Marla added wildlife coordination to her list. A woman from the school board asked whether the company would fund air filters for classrooms if particulate levels rose during windy weeks. Frank said the company would participate in a mitigation fund under ADQ oversight if monitors showed exceedances tied to activity. Marla held his gaze a moment, then said she would include a requirement for a contingency fund and a public dashboard for baseline data. From the fourth row, Ava stood and spoke without being recognized. She said the project was about greed and that certain people were choosing money over family and over the neighborhood. The company was hiding impact, and the county would regret this. Heads turned. Marla lifted a hand and asked speakers to keep to the agenda. Pat rose again and disclosed for the record that the speaker was a relative with a private financial dispute unrelated to the permit process. Family matters were being handled elsewhere and should not be tied to ADQ's role. Marla thanked him and reminded the room that personal accusations did not help the agency set conditions. Sarah returned to the microphone and restated commitments on dust-water traffic hours and public reporting. The room steadied. Marla looked down her list and spoke so the far row could hear. Baseline monitoring of air and water had commenced, and ADEC acknowledged it on the record. A dust control plan, a traffic plan, and a noise schedule would be required and posted publicly. Quarterly reports would be delivered to ADQ and made available to the community. A contingency fund for school air filtration would be created if monitors showed exceedances linked to activity. Wildlife coordination would be built into the plan. Any claimed rival boundary would need to be filed in the proper venue and would not delay environmental review in this forum. Once plans and baseline reports were received, the process would move to the next step under state procedures. She set a calendar for the first reporting deadline and asked for any last comments. No one rose. She adjourned. The scrape of metal chairs on tile replaced voices. People formed small knots and spoke in low tones. The school board woman shook Sarah's hand. The mine inspector compared notes with Frank about the traffic plan. Hank tucked his copy under his arm and left without looking over. Pat closed his binder and handed me a copy of his notes. We would meet tomorrow to plan filings and timelines. Outside, the county steps held the last warmth of the day, and jacaranda blossoms lay like small pieces of sky along the walk. Jack stood by the curb and gave me a look that held more relief than argument. Ava waited a few paces away with edges showing. I did not walk toward either one. I stood still and let ordinary traffic wash the meeting out of my ears. The process had not chosen sides, it had chosen order. That was enough to carry me back to the car and into the clean evening light. By midweek, the house felt like it had exhaled. Paperwork moved along its tracks, and the quiet held. Jack called that afternoon and told me he had started therapy with a counselor named Dana Cook. He said he was learning what a boundary sounded like when you said it out loud and then did not apologize for it. His voice had fewer edges. He asked if the kids could come out over the weekend. He said Ava might be busy. I told him the gate would be open. On Thursday, I watched the sky fold into itself while I watered the mesquite. Jack texted that Dana had given him homework. He was to choose one place in a week where he would not abandon his plan to placate someone else. An hour later, he sent another note from the parking lot outside the school. Ava had messaged him 3 times to say a contractor could meet only at 3 and that he should skip pickup and drive across town. He wrote that he had told her no. He would pick up Megan and Tommy. The contractor would have to wait for a time that did not step on the children. He added that his hands had shaken, but the words had stood. I read the message twice and put the phone down face first on the table. The kettle began to sing. The wind moved the curtain. I felt something in my chest loosen like a knot giving up. Saturday arrived bright and clear. I baked a pan of cornbread and set out a pitcher of lemonade on the porch table. The pickup rolled in just before noon. Tommy jumped out before the engine had gone quiet and sprinted to the fence and back. Megan climbed down slower with that careful look 10-year-olds get when they are trying on being older. Jack opened the cab door for them and set a small overnight bag by the steps. He said Ava had a design consult and would not make it. His mouth said the words he needed to say and then let them go. We ate on the porch because the breeze was just right. Tommy bounced his heels against the step and told me he had learned to whistle, then tried, then laughed when the sound came out as a squeak. Megan watched the windmill like it might be posing for her. After lunch, I brought out the old instant camera from the hall closet and a canvas strap that Lee had used on road trips. The kids looked at the camera like it was a magic trick. I showed Megan how the aperture ring could make the background soften so the windmill stood sharp. I showed Tommy how to frame with the corners of his hands and to leave space where a thing was moving. We walked out toward the pasture and the light sat right on everything as if it had meant to be photographed all day. Megan practiced on the windmill first. She breathed and pressed and watched the small square slide out. She held it flat and still while the picture came up. Tommy photographed his sister photographing the windmill and then turned to the mesquite and declared it a tree with elbows. We laughed, and Megan said she would allow him that title for the day only. Jack stood with his hands in his pockets and watched them with a look I had not seen since the first time he held Megan and could not stop counting her fingers. We moved to the edge of the wash where the ground is a bit higher and the light spreads wider. I told them about a woman named Elena Valdez who had walked this land long before any of us and had written letters about what she saw. Megan asked if Elena had taken pictures too. I said she had taken pictures with words and lines on paper. I told them she wrote about the wind changing after midnight and about a line that ran diagonal across the lower pasture. I told them that when you pay attention to a place for long enough, it pays you back in detail. Tommy said detail sounded like a secret that liked to be found. We sat on the warm rock by the wash and passed the camera back and forth. Megan tried a close frame on a piece of stone with a blue-green streak. Tommy chased a lizard with his eyes and then grinned when it stopped on a sun patch just long enough to be part of a picture. Jack sat beside me and said therapy was harder than he had thought it would be because it asked him to stay when his habit was to run. He said Dana had asked him who he was when he was not performing for someone else. He had not had an answer that first hour. He said he was working late. In late afternoon, the light went soft and kind. I walked back to the house and I sliced apples and set out a small dish of salt the way my mother always did. Megan placed the day's pictures on the table in a neat fan and studied them like a small editor. She chose one of the windmill where the blades looked still and moving at the same time. Tommy chose one where the dog from next door had wandered into the corner with a look of great importance. Jack took a picture of the three of us with the porch behind and said he would keep it on his dresser for mornings when the kitchen project felt like a test. As the shadows lengthened, we moved to the living room, and I brought out the letters I had found in the box weeks ago. The paper had softened with years, but the ink still held. I read a few lines about the field in late summer and about goats that refused one patch of grass for reasons only they understood. Megan asked what that meant. I said sometimes the land tells you no in a way that is not loud. Tommy nodded like someone who knew about small refusals. Jack listened with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded steady and quiet. Before they left, Megan asked if she could see the windmill once more. We walked out without speaking. The blades were almost still. Her hair lifted with the last small breeze. She put the camera strap over her head, raised the viewfinder, and took her time. When the square fed out, she held it flat the way I had shown her. She watched it develop without impatience. She blew on it once like a prayer. At the truck, she reached into her pocket and pressed the picture into my hand. She said that this place felt like me. She said she wanted me to have the one she liked best. Tommy hugged my waist like he always had, and then tried to look older than 7 and failed in a way that made me grateful. Jack loaded the bag, buckled the kids in, and stood for a second with the door open. He said thank you without ceremony. I told him I would see them soon and meant it. After the dust settled, I went back inside with the last of the light riding the floorboards. I found a simple frame on the bookshelf and slid the small square behind clean glass. The windmill sat centered and calm. The sky held a color that looked like patience. I set the frame on the kitchen shelf by the Roadrunner magnet and the notebook where my list waited for tomorrow. The room felt warmer than the thermometer said. Outside, the wind made one quiet turn, and the house answered with its soft old sounds. I stood there for a while with my hand on the counter and let the day tell me it had been good. Weeks began to stack in a clean line. Baseline monitors blinked on the fence posts at dawn, and the windmill kept a steady pace. By late fall, the pilot and bulk sampling permits were posted in Pat's office with fresh stamps, and a small crew from Sonoran Copper and Minerals set a temporary pad in the lower pasture. Water trucks darkened the track and kept dust quiet. Frank checked in at the porch before each shift gave a time window and let the crew do their measured work. Sarah added another air meter and 2 shallow monitoring wells. She logged serial numbers on her tablet and showed me where the graphs would live, so neighbors could see air and water as numbers rather than rumors. The state mine inspector stopped in, read the engineer's note by the pantry, tested the braces with the same steady, even pressure as before, and signed her line on a form without ceremony. No one set a foot past the first stair. The rule held. Sampling began before Thanksgiving. Cores and bulk bags were labeled and weighed, then a portion of the material left under a toll milling arrangement. Sarah explained it at my table with a pencil on the back of an envelope. A buyer would take some test tons under an offtake letter, so a net smelter return could be calculated before full operations. It sounded like a knot until the first report arrived. Then it sounded like math that favored patience. January brought a thin skin of ice on the bird bath and a first round of baseline acknowledgments from ADAQ. Marla's email logged the dust and traffic plans and noted that reporting had begun on schedule. Frank sent a short field note that the pilot was behaving. Sarah forwarded a photograph of a narrow band of color in a core with a line that said the seam was keeping its promise. By early spring, the accounting turned from talk to totals. The company sent a pre-statement that listed what counted as deductions in the NSR formula and what did not. Pat read every line, circled 2 words, and had Lauren adjust the definitions so that transport and smelting were exactly that, and nothing more. When the quarter closed, a final statement and cover letter arrived in my inbox and again in the mail because I like paper. Tonnage and head grade sat where they should, charges posted cleanly, and the bottom line finished with a number that pulled a breath from my chest and handed it back. $512,000 with cents I barely noticed. I printed the top page and covered account details with a strip of paper for my file. The quarter number went into the notebook that lives under the Roadrunner magnet. Then I drove into town, walked to the hospital billing window, and asked to settle Lee's account in full. The clerk read the total in a voice made kind by practice. My hand did not shake as I wrote the check. A zero balance letter slid across the counter light as a feather and heavier than it looked. In the parking lot, I sat in the quiet car and let the sun warm my knees and said a private thank you into the air. Back home, I made modest changes that felt like care rather than display. Insulation in the attic, windows that looked like the old ones but worked better, a small straightforward kitchen that could absorb grandchildren flour, and a Sunday roast without complaint, a stronger internet line that could carry a video call without sputter. The crew worked clean and left the porch steps swept at the end of each day. By the first hot week, the rooms held their cool and the kettle sang sooner. The state mine inspector returned for a scheduled recheck of the sealed drift. She pressed the braces, checked the tape, logged it, and asked if I had heard any movement or felt any changes. I said no. She nodded and said the plan would be renewed for another interval. She told me again that doing things in order keeps people out of trouble. The sentence landed like a small blessing. On the other side of town, the refinance that had set so many thoughts in motion met the paper it could not change. Rachel at SunWest sent Jack a revised offer with a higher rate and more protections for the lender, the same title exception standing where it had always stood. The kitchen project that had driven the rush slid back to a someday shelf. Jack told me he would not chase a moving line. Ava sent an email that read like a warning. She said she would take the story public. Pat replied from his desk with calm legal language and asked that all further contact travel through counsel. The noise cut off as if someone had found a switch. Work at the ranch kept its respectful pace. The crew finished the bulk shipments in the plan. ADQ posted the first quarterly note that reports had arrived and that baseline values sat inside expectations. The school board accepted a set of air purifiers from the contingency fund we had agreed to use when wind made classrooms ask for help. Sarah sent me the link to the dashboard. The particulate graph rose and fell like a slow breath. I checked it in the morning the way people check weather. June brought a thicker envelope and a check because I had asked for both paper and wires. The figure matched the email. Pat reviewed the reconciliation and called to say it was clean. I placed the statement behind the first one in the binder and wrote the total again in the notebook because writing makes a truth sit down. On the way back from town, I bought a better well filter and a water heater that did not sigh at its job. In the hardware aisle, I ran my fingers along a length of copper pipe and smiled at the idea that the same metal had chosen a road under my pasture. Jack and the kids came out that weekend with groceries I had not asked for and a calm I had hoped for. Megan checked the small frame on the shelf to be sure her picture had not moved. Tommy ran a circuit around the yard and reported that lizards were holding steady. We ate tacos and cold peaches and watched the windmill mind its own time. No one mentioned the bank. We did not need to. That evening after they left, I walked down to the outcrop near the wash, where late light makes the rock show its color. A thin run of blue-green lifted itself out of the gray just enough to be seen. I took a few pictures and sent them to Sarah with a short note that said the vein looked good tonight. 10 minutes later, she wrote back that the images were beautiful and that she was glad the land was still showing off. I set the phone on the table and let the words rest. Inside the safe held its papers, the binder held its tabs, the notebook held its numbers. Outside, crickets struck up and the air smelled clean and familiar. I turned off the lamp and stood in the doorway to the pantry. The tape was still bright. The hinge still caught where it should. On the porch, the wind laid one cool line across my forehead and then left the yard alone. It felt like a day that had paid in money and in steadiness, and I let that be enough. Ruth Payton called in the morning and asked if I could come to Bisbee. She said a box in her hallway cabinet belonged with my place more than with hers. The drive over the Mule Mountains felt like turning pages. Copper roofs flashed between cottonwoods, and the Copper Queen kept its stubborn grace. Ruth's house sat on a narrow street that made cars behave. She met me at the door with a shawl around her shoulders and the look of someone passing a small flame from one candle to another. On the dining table, a wooden box waited beside a stack of photographs gone soft at the corners. She said these had been tucked at the back of a case from an estate sale years ago and that a name on the envelopes matched what I had mentioned at the market. The photographs came first. A young woman stood near a head frame with a scarf at her hairline and calm in her eyes that made the timbers behind her look temporary. A man I knew only from stories leaned on a truck door with his sleeves rolled and a grin that did not hide the work. A thin strip on the back of one image carried a late 1940s date and a single word that tied the picture to our wash. I held each piece by the corners and saw the diagonal of the hills behind them and thought of the line on my map. Ruth untied a bundle of letters. The paper had the color of tea, but the ink held. She said the writer was Elena Valdez. The script leaned forward as if eager to arrive. Ruth apologized for the Spanish she did not speak and asked if I could follow. I told her I knew enough for simple thought. The first page spoke of midnight wind and goats that refused one patch by the lower fence and of ground that lifted when it should run flat. The next named a line below the earth traveling from the southwest toward the northeast and asked the reader to trust it even when eyes could not see. A third carried a short prayer for safety written like a recipe. Ruth's hand paused on a last envelope. Inside lay a pencil sketch. The wash bent like a loose elbow, the fence held a steady run and a diagonal crossed both, with the certainty of a knife that knows its job. A margin note said, "Careful hands should handle what the earth might give." I did not cry. Something in me clicked into place the way a lock settles when the key seats. Lee had saved and waited and had not told me because he was holding 2 clocks at once. The slow one for paper and permission, the slower one for grief. He had wanted the land to arrive in the hands of someone who would thank it before asking for anything. The room felt full of his quiet. Ruth poured tea and said she had wondered for years what story sat behind that box, and was relieved to see it find its address. She asked if I wanted the letters and the sketch. I said I did, and that I would store them the way one stores a birth certificate. We drove to a small copy shop near Brewery Gulch. The clerk fed each page through a scanner while we watched the images bloom on the screen. I saved the files to a small drive from my purse and asked for paper copies with a faint archive mark so no one would mistake them for originals. Back at Ruth's table, I slipped each piece into a clear sleeve and into a thin binder I had brought on a hunch. Ruth touched the cover and said her house felt lighter. I said the ranch would too. On the way back, I stopped at the overlook. The town lay stacked in its bowl roofs, like coin streets like lines in a palm. I thought about a woman long gone who had sketched a diagonal on a page, and how that line had found me at a kitchen table many years later. I drove home with the windows down. The air smelled like mesquite and warm rock. That evening, I set the binder beside the map and the old assay page, and took a photograph of the three together for my own record. I sent a scan of the sketch to Pat with a note that said, "This explains patience, though it is not a title document." He replied that he would add it to the family file because meaning belongs beside math. Near 8, my phone showed Jack's name. I let it go to voicemail and then called back because I wanted to set the tone. He said he was driving home from therapy and that the work was making him quieter in a way that surprised him. Dana had asked what he wanted from family if the word money were not allowed in the room. He said the answer came out simple. He wanted time with his children that did not feel like a negotiation. He wanted to tell his mother a small good thing without it becoming a tool for someone else. He said he was not calling to ask for anything. He wanted to tell me that Megan had finished a book on her own and that Tommy had tied a double knot and then taught a friend. I told him I was glad to hear his voice when it was not carrying a demand. He took a breath and asked if I would be present more often. The kids had asked about coming out again, and he wanted a plan that did not depend on anyone else's mood. I said yes with conditions simple enough to remember. Our time would be built around the kids and their routines. Respect would stand at the door every time. Money would not enter the conversation. If it slipped in, the visit would end, and we would try again another day. I said these rules were rails, so the train reached the right station. He said the rules sounded like relief. He could manage that and would ask Dana how to keep a boundary honest when someone nearby wanted to bend it. He suggested the first weekend next month because soccer had a gap and the weather would let us walk the lower pasture without burning shoes. I opened the calendar on the counter and wrote the date like I was laying a small footing. He asked if we needed to clear anything with the company for that weekend. I told him the access plan already set the work days, and that the crew would be on the other side of the property during those hours. He said good, and that he would bring sandwiches worth the drive. We did not speak of the bank. We did not mention the email that tried to be a threat and went quiet when Pat answered. We kept to children and schedules and weather and the way a day can be good when it minds its own business. Before we signed off, he said he was proud of Megan for her picture and proud of me for the way the house felt different. I told him the windmill looked like patience under glass. He laughed in the old way that made me see the boy he had been and said he would call after practice. I set the phone face down and turned the kettle on. While the water warmed, I opened the binder again and looked at Elena's sketch. The faint pencil line across the page matched the one in my head and the one under my feet. I thought about a woman who found language gentle enough to carry a vein and strong enough to carry a warning. Handle with care. Ask permission. Wait for the right season. Steam rose. I took the cup to the porch and sat where the air moves first when night arrives. The windmill made one slow turn and stopped at a good angle for the frame above the sink. The safe under the bed held its papers. The house behind me held its cool. The day had added something that did not need to be counted. I stayed until the tea went warm, rinsed the cup, switched off the kitchen light, and let the quiet make the last choice. The next month arrived with clear mornings and a sky that looked newly washed. Jack parked by the windmill on a Saturday, the kids tumbled out, and the day arranged itself around sandwiches, sunlight, and the diagonal path that lives on Elena's sketch. We kept to the small rituals that make visits easy. Megan checked the lens cloth in her pocket. Tommy raced the dog from next door and declared the fence a finish line. Jack asked about school schedules and cleats, and whether the apples would come on early this year. We did not touch the subject that used to bend every conversation out of shape. When the light slid down the ridge, he loaded 2 sleepy bodies and waved. The gate clicked shut with the neat sound of an agreed boundary doing its job. Summer taught the ranch its new heartbeat. Sonoran copper and minerals kept to the plan with a steadiness that felt like respect. Baseline graphs lived online where anyone could read numbers without adjectives. ADQ posted quarterly acknowledgments. The state mine inspector walked the pantry doorway on schedule and signed the line that said the seal held, and the engineer's note remained the rule. Trucks used the flag turnouts we had set. Water trucks kept dust where it belonged. Traffic avoided school hours. The wash ran clear after monsoon and then dried back to rock and memory. Money moved like a clean machine. Escrow had released $5 million in the first window after signing and after the last condition on the checklist clicked into place. Quarterly statements arrived on time and within the range everyone now recognized. Pat read the reconciliations line by line and called only when there was something to celebrate or correct. Most days there was nothing to fix, only quiet proof that adults had done what they said they would do. I wrote each total into the small notebook under the Roadrunner magnet and filed the paper behind the red folder that still feels like a beginning. I spent the proceeds the way a good house spends heat. Insulation first. Windows that look like the old ones but finally work. A plain kitchen that forgives knives and flour and a Sunday roast. A table long enough for puzzles and homework and peach halves. The internet line stopped pretending and finally did its job. I carried Lee's last medical balance to 0 because it felt right to close that ledger with a clean line. I sent a small check to the library in Bisbee with a note that thanked them for keeping the past on a shelf. Life on the other side rearranged itself without my help. Jack learned the pause before yes and kept it long enough to hear what the yes would cost. Therapy asked hard questions, and he stayed in the room for the answers. He picked up his children himself and told contractors to find hours that did not step on bedtime. He said no when no was the honest word. Ava lives apart now. News arrives as bare facts that drift across town whether you invite them or not. A change of address. A project mentioned. The email that once tried to sound like a threat never found a sequel. Pat sits between me and any new noise with the calm of a wall that has always been there. Autumn brought a morning when the pasture wore a familiar gold. Megan turned 11 and goes looking for angles the way a painter hunts shade. Tommy turned 8 and stacks kindling with the gravity of a banker. On their Sundays here, we tend to work that feels like home. Megan cleans a lens with the corner of a soft towel. Tommy checks the water pan for birds and reports like a ranger. Jack sits on the step and tells me a story about a science project that fizzes on purpose. We let the day be about small good things and leave the rest to the file cabinet. Sometimes I stand by the windmill and hear a sentence from another room in time. Go away and keep that old ranch. In the quiet of this year, it sounds less like an insult and more like a compass. I did go away. I did keep the ranch. I did it with paper that says what it means, with a lawyer who reads every line, with a state office that cares more about compliance than charm, with an escrow that opens only when every hinge is aligned. I did it with a list on a kitchen counter and a pencil that crosses off one item at a time. The numbers tell their story, but the real proof lives in smaller things. The pantry door stays taped and still. The engineer's note remains the law of that room. The windmill sometimes stops at the exact angle Megan captured in the Polaroid that sits above the sink. The children know that the ranch has rules, and that rules protect good possibilities. Jack laughs again, in a tone that belongs to a man who likes the company of his own choices. Even the desert has softened its voice. The crickets start a little earlier. The coyotes pass like careful shadows instead of announcements. Late in the year, I drove to Bisbee and left a framed copy of Elena's sketch with the museum that mines local stories. The curator wrote my name carefully in a ledger that looked older than both of us and said the drawing would hang beside a map of the old claims. On the way back, I stopped at the Overlook and let the town stack itself in its bowl. Roofs like coins, streets like lines in a palm. I thought of the woman who traced a diagonal in pencil and of the years it took for that line to find the right hands. On New Year's morning, I carried coffee to the porch and let the steam warm my face. A coyote rode a careful path in the far sand. The windmill turned once and rested. I remembered the day in the lawyer's office when silence tasted like failure. I remembered 83 calls that tried to pull me off my own ground. I remembered the escrow wire notice that read like a beginning instead of a victory lap. Most of all, I felt the difference between being needed and being valued, and how often a person has to step outside a room to be seen. I do not think of this as beating anyone. I am not keeping score on a chalkboard. What I keep is a voice that sounds like mine. I keep a place that answers when I thank it. I keep a family that is learning to speak without turning need into a weapon. I keep a story in which a woman my age does not vanish when the loudest person in the room tells her to go. If you found yourself at a moment that looked like reunion, but came with a price, where would your hand land? Would you offer more forgiveness or hold tighter to the boundary that keeps you kind to yourself? Tell me what you would choose and why. Share the line you would draw and the lesson you would keep. If this quiet kind of justice speaks to you, leave your thoughts past the story to someone who needs a steady voice and stay for the next tale. The windmill will be here turning when the air asks it to.